Hello everyone, I'm Andy Oakley on New Zealand Issues. Today's issue, the dangers of tribalism. In this video I'll look at tribalism as it relates to New Zealand and how its presence shaped our violent past and how it may bring us down once again unless we curb the growing tribal narrative. Perhaps the most disturbing thing is this tribal narrative comes from our government, the education system, our media, and a section of already indoctrinated public. Make no mistake, just because we live in a comfortable Western democracy today, it doesn't mean that war and violence are not just over the horizon. History shows us that societies have a habit of collapsing. Firstly, what is tribalism? A tribe is a group of people who are connected to each other because they share something in common that matters to them. Now that could be ethnicity, culture, class, religion, ideology, or even language. And the most common definition in New Zealand relates to the tribal groups who first populated our country. These tribes were similar to almost every other tribal nation that has ever existed. If we go back far enough, we are all related to tribal groups who roamed Africa. You see, tribalism has been the very backbone of cultures around the world, from the very beginning of recorded history and far beyond. It was a great survival tool in a world of constant deprivation, starvation, fearful desperation, tyranny and enslavement of many forms. And as anyone who has ever studied New Zealand history will know, deprivation, starvation, fearful desperation, tyranny and enslavement of many forms neatly describes the culture of many of the separate tribes in New Zealand pre the Treaty of Waitangi. For example, there was the extermination of the many tribes living in the South Island by Ngāi Tahu, who had only ventured into the South Island in the late 1700s. The extermination of the Ngāti Hautu by the Maniapoto. The extermination and enslavement of Taranaki tribes by Te Wherowhero of Waikato. The extermination of practically everyone, including Ngāti Ira, by Te Raupraha and Ngāti Toa. And also the extermination of the Moriori by Ngāti Mutunga and Ngāti Tama of Taranaki in the 1830s. Of course, New Zealand's violent tribal history is not unique. Almost every tribal culture behaved in similar ways at some point. However, the modern Western culture that thrives throughout the world today emerged from tribalism. And the further we move from tribalism, the safer and fairer our lives have become. So historical tribalism based around survival in cultures which were not well organised looks pretty dangerous, even in New Zealand. But even in a modern Western democracy such as New Zealand, tribalism has the same capacity to be destructive because it creates groups which have a propensity to develop group thinking, which leads to a polarisation or a pattern of thinking which brings out the dark side of human nature. And if the commonality of the group is based around race, or more accurately ancestry, then this is the darkest of dark sides, as it allows people to be bound into a group which allows them to make distinctions between us, members of the group, and them, those who are not members of the group, on racial grounds. Yet this is exactly what is becoming more prevalent in New Zealand. Despite an agreement by almost all of the tribal leaders in New Zealand, which was meant to be the death of tribalism, the Treaty of Waitangi, we are reluctantly being forced back towards tribalism by our government, who have recognised a new tribe, one that did not exist before the Treaty of Waitangi, Māori. It is of vital importance to know that the group Māori did not exist pre the treaty. The word Māori, with a capital M, which became a noun used to describe a member of the Aboriginal people of New Zealand, was not used in New Zealand language or literature until well after the signing of the treaty. And this is because the tribes were separate. Many of them had different languages and cultures, and some looked entirely different to other groups. One only needs to read the journals of the early explorers who described the people of New Zealand from the darkest of Negroes to the fairest skinned redheads in the 1770s. This is half a century before European colonisation. This knowledge has been wiped from our history through a process of racism, inaccuracy and indoctrination. all the separate groups are now one group, known as Māori, who have been given the distinction of being their own race in New Zealand legislation. The government's forced tribalism has allowed a negative pattern of attitudes and behaviours that human beings tend to adopt when they identify with their tribes. The us and them distinctions defined by tribal boundaries becomes an acknowledged way to make normative judgments. For instance, if you look European, our government may state that you are a Pākehā and are less interested in your wider family than Māori are of theirs. Or if you look Māori, the government might state that you have a special bond with rivers and mountains that Pākehā don't. Of course, this is all nonsense, and one cannot make sweeping judgments about people based on how they look or who one of their distant relations were. Yet this is the norm in New Zealand. How is it possible today to view what were separate tribes in the 1800s, who arrived separately, lived separately, looked different, spoke different, were in a constant state of war, as one tribe or people, particularly when the majority of these people are in fact mostly European ancestry? And how is it possible for a treaty, which was clearly an agreement by the tribal leaders to leave the destructive ways of tribalism behind them, to be used in the New Zealand education system to further entrench tribalism into our schools by forcing children to celebrate Māori as tangata whenua? Well, the answer is because the us and them mentality, which is forced upon them by the government and schools, also forces us to make moral judgments that follow the groupthink. And it's not just moral judgments either. It is also what people will believe and what they won't believe. Our beliefs follow the contours of our group affiliations. And it's this which make it possible for people such as ex-mayor and recovering racist Andrew Judd to make sweeping racist generalisations about Pākehā being broken on national television, and to actually believe what he's saying. Whereas I would wager, and perhaps Don Brash should have told him, to hold such a belief is a sign that A, his racism has returned in abundance, and B, along with a psychiatric disorder. Now, the fact that Andrew Judd would be polarised enough to think that Māori are a separate kind of people, and that he would say it publicly, and that the media would promote it, is a sign that the worst aspects of tribalism have found its way into our culture. And that is the unreasonable notion that members of tribes or separate groups think collectively similar to each other. Whereas in reality, science has proved the opposite is the case. When left to their own devices, there is more difference within groups than between groups. And what this ultimately means is that a society that is structured around tribalism, or the polarisation that groups are very different from each other, which describes how we are heading in New Zealand, cannot function properly, as these separate groups disagree on more things and more strongly. As an example, if you were to pick up a paper in New Zealand in 1970 and looked at who was disagreeing and the degree to which they were disagreed, and compared it with a paper today, which is full of iwi and Māori disagreeing with everything, you would see just how far we have come towards an eruption of violence. Now, this is a serious matter. We cannot continue to tell our children, our teenagers and university students that Māori are separate. They are a different race. They collectively see the world differently and so require separate representation, education and a legal system that caters for them. You may ask, why not? Because as you've seen already, unless the people protest very loudly, they are likely to get it. And when they do, that will be the first steps towards a concentration camp in New Zealand, as has happened many times in the 20th century in other countries. The truth is, there is no them. There is only us. I've been Andy Oakley. Noho oro mai.